Hi again, everybody. In this second unit on climate, we're going to look at the main components of climate and their influence on our plant selections. By the end of this unit, you'll be able to define drought tolerant, describe how the rainfall pattern of California's Mediterranean type climate influences our plant selections for a given landscape, and describe how maximum and minimum temperatures, solar radiation, wind, and proximity to the ocean all influence our plant selections for a given landscape. As a recap from the previous unit, the components of climate are temperature, and we look at maximum, minimum, and average temperatures, precipitation, which includes rain, snow, sleet, hail, and fog trip here at the coast, wind speed and wind direction, relative humidity, and solar radiation. And climate is influenced by latitude, altitude, topography, and proximity to the ocean. The climate in any given location is a result of complex interactions between all of the factors listed above. And climate is likely to change in the future as a result of anthropogenic influences. If we're to make regionally appropriate sustainable plant choices, we need to take the characteristics of our Mediterranean type climate into account. The general characteristics of that, if you remember, are warm or hot dry summers and mild wet winters. In California, that means a long dry period of around 7 months, usually from May through November, when we get little to no rain, and 5 to 6 months of relatively mild winters with intermittent rain from November through April. This general climate pattern started to develop in California between 7 and 4 million years ago. And it's predicted that climate change will accentuate this pattern, with summers becoming hotter and drier, winters possibly wetter, but also with increased periods of drought. The amount of rainfall received in California in the winter months generally increases as we move from Southern California to Northern California, and in general decreases as we move from the coast on the west to the east. Regardless of the amount of annual rainfall, though, the seasonal pattern in how that rainfall falls in much of the state is the same. Plants evolve with the climate conditions that exist in the ecosystems in which they grow natively. Our California native plants have evolved with our Mediterranean type climate, as have the plants that are native to the 4 other regions of the world with this climate pattern, and many of them exhibit adaptations to heat and drought that we'll talk about in another unit. It's important to note, though, that not all plants native to Mediterranean climates are adapted to summer drought. There are several ecosystems within the regions with this climate type that are wet or moist year-round, such as riparian and wetland ecosystems, and the plant communities here are not drought tolerant. They don't need to be because their roots usually have access to plenty of water. So please don't fall into the trap that a lot of people do of saying that all California native plants are drought tolerant. Drought tolerant is the ability of a plant to survive from one significant rain event to the next without any supplemental irrigation. If you're a plant that's native to neotropical areas, like the 3 on the right here, the hybrid Salvia amistad, passion flower, or Tibouchina, the princess flower, then your period of drought tolerance doesn't necessarily need to be any more than perhaps a month or so. If you grow natively in Death Valley, though, like the Joshua tree pictured on the right, then your period of drought tolerance may need to be up to 2 years. In most of California, a drought-tolerant plant is one that can survive our 7-month dry period without any irrigation. And a plant that's drought-tolerant in our area, in the Greater Bay Area and the Central Coast, isn't necessarily one that's going to be drought tolerant in Southern California, where temperatures are typically higher in the summer and rainfall in the winter is lower. Following the period of rapid population growth in California after the gold rush in 1849, many of the plants used in our ornamental landscapes weren't California natives or even plants from other Mediterranean-type climates. Our landscapes were strongly influenced by English horticulture and included extensive lawns and also many plants from temperate climates that have year-round rainfall. Examples of these include rhododendrons, azaleas, and camellias. California's ornamental landscapes took advantage of the long growing season and warm summers by growing a vast range of plants, many of which weren't adapted to the long dry summers. And therefore we applied supplemental irrigation to our landscapes in order for the plants to survive the summer months. Depending on the location, much of this water had often traveled a long distance in order to get our plants to thrive, and of course to provide water for the state's growing cities. San Francisco's water came, and still does, from the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir, some 150 miles from the city. And water for Los Angeles comes from the Sierra. In recent years, California has woken up to the realities of its Mediterranean-type climate, the unreliability of our winter rains, and the overdrafted aquifers. And many water districts have been offering financial incentives to their customers to replace thirsty lawns and plants with plants that require less water in the summer months. So the most important climate factors influencing our plant selections are the general rainfall pattern in California and the amount of rainfall in our area or the location of the landscape that we're working on. Sustainable plant choices are ones which require minimal amounts of summer water to keep them looking good. We may consider installing rainwater catchment tanks if there's space, or a grey water system, which would reduce our reliance on using potable water on our plants and perhaps eliminate it altogether. Many of the water districts also offer rebates for rainwater tanks and grey water systems. So how do we know which plants don't need much supplemental water? One of the best guides is the WCOLS website. WCOLS stands for Water Use Classification of Landscape Species. This database contains the estimated water usage ratings for over 3,500 plants that are commonly used in California landscapes. It allocates a water usage rating of very low, low, moderate, or high to each of the plants in the database based on the area in which the plant is being used. Just like the climate zones that we talked about in the first unit on climate, these water usage ratings that WCOLS applies are just guides. The actual amount of irrigation water that a plant needs is based on a complicated equation that takes into account temperature, wind speed, soil type, and relative humidity. And we'll talk more about how much water to give plants in another unit. The second most important factor influencing our plant selections is temperature, both highs and lows. All plants have a minimum temperature above which they can survive, and this minimum temperature is usually referred to as a plant's cold hardiness or just hardiness. This tolerance level is related to where the plant grows natively. Plants native to tropical areas of the world only need to be hardy to perhaps 45 or even 50 degrees Fahrenheit. If you're a plant native to an alpine region, though, then you need to be able to tolerate sub-zero temperatures for several consecutive months. Cold hardiness is often expressed in terms of a minimum temperature. For example, this Aeonium arboreum, the tree Aeonium, featured on the right in the screenshot from San Marcos Growers website, says that this plant has a cold hardiness of 25 to 30 degrees Fahrenheit. But often the ability to survive sustained periods of cold is probably more important than that absolute figure that's usually featured on marketing materials for plants. For many plants, the cooling process of fall and winter is important. Cooler temperatures, often coupled with shorter day lengths, trigger changes in plant growth, in flowering, leaf senescence, and the onset of winter dormancy. Diurnal temperature fluctuations, which are the differences between the maximum daytime and minimum nighttime temperatures, can also have an impact on things like fall color in winter deciduous trees. And we'll talk about that in another module. Temperatures during the winter dormant period are important for many plants, especially many fruit plants, as the length of the cold period, which is referred to as the chilling period or vernalization, is critical to the initiation of flower buds and then flowering and fruiting in the following year. For example, many fruit trees require a specific number of chilling hours in the winter to initiate flower buds. If no flower buds are initiated, there'll be no flowers and no fruit. This obviously has important economic consequences for commercial growers. The number of chilling hours required varies between species and even within species, so it's important to know how many chilling hours are typical for your area and to choose fruit trees that match that temperature range. Tulips are a good example of an ornamental plant that needs winter chilling in order to initiate flower buds and then bloom the following spring. Most of the tulips that we see in gardens are hybrids, but the species tulips that these hybrids have been bred from grow natively at fairly high altitudes in Persia and Central Asia, where winter temperatures are very cold. In most of California, tulips don't receive enough chilling hours to initiate flower buds, and therefore don't bloom reliably from year to year. So in coastal California, they're usually treated as annuals and thrown away after they've bloomed. All plants have a temperature range in which they grow best. As temperature increases, photosynthesis and therefore plant growth also increase, provided there's no limiting factor such as water. Photosynthesis peaks at around 85 degrees Fahrenheit, then starts to decline as plants close their stomata in response to the heat in order to conserve water. Sustained high temperatures can lead to heat stress and damage, especially when coupled with drought stress, and may even lead to the plant dying. We therefore need to select plants that can tolerate not just the winter cold, but also the high summer temperatures that are typical for our area. With some plants, it's possible to compensate somewhat for high temperatures by giving plants more water. But that isn't a sustainable option in areas where water is a scarce and valuable resource. Symptoms of drought and heat stress that we might see include the wilting of young growth. Young growth is typically softer. The leaf cuticles haven't fully developed, and so the leaves lose water more quickly. And sometimes, especially when we have heat waves, the plant just can't pull water up from the roots through the plant as fast as water is being lost through evapotranspiration. So the young growth, which is vulnerable at the tips of the plants, usually wilts first. We may see older leaves being dropped. Older leaves are less photosynthetically efficient, but they still require photosynthates to maintain them. Therefore, in times of stress, it's beneficial for the plant to drop these older, less photosynthetically efficient leaves when there are limiting factors such as lack of water or stressful high temperatures. We may also see the yellowing or browning of leaves. Too much sun can destroy chloroplasts. These are the organs which contain chlorophyll. Flower buds may not open. Again, the opening of flower buds requires energy, and that requires photosynthesis. So if the flower buds don't open, then fruit may not form because the flowers won't be pollinated if they're closed. Even if the flowers are pollinated, fruit may not form, or it may be small because the plant needs to be photosynthesizing sufficiently and efficiently in order to produce enough carbohydrates to lay down in these fruits. Soil is warmed by the absorption of shortwave radiation from the sun, and it loses heat in general by evaporative cooling. Warm soil temperatures between 55 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit favor root growth and development, provided there's sufficient water available. Above 75 degrees Fahrenheit, root growth and development start to slow down and stop altogether at around 100 degrees Fahrenheit. It's not often that the soil in the root zone becomes that hot, but the soil surface can easily reach 100 degrees Fahrenheit on hot days, and the reflected heat from the soil surface can increase the temperature of lower leaves on plants and increase water loss through the leaves. Low-growing ground cover plants are especially vulnerable, especially herbaceous perennials, and some plants have leaf adaptations to cope with this. Examples include the small, low-growing ground cover, Diamondia margaritae, and also our native coast buckwheat, the Eriogonum latifolium, which both have silvery-colored lower leaf surfaces, which reflects heat and helps to keep the leaf cooler and therefore reduce water loss. Applying a thick layer of mulch can reduce large fluctuations in soil temperature by acting as insulation. It keeps the soil cooler in summer and warmer in winter. Mulch also helps to conserve soil moisture by reducing the loss of water from the soil through evaporation. The type of mulch that we use is usually a matter of personal preference, cost, and aesthetics. And we need to use around 3 inches in order to reduce evaporation effectively. 4 inches are ideal if we're also wanting to use the mulch as weed suppression. Applying 3 or 4 inches of mulch can be expensive, but something I've done in the past is to lay 3 inches of the cheapest wood chips that I can find first, then apply just 1 inch of the more expensive bark, which personally I find more aesthetically pleasing. And that definitely reduces the cost of a project by quite a lot. It's important to remember, though, that wood mulch will slow the rate of penetration of any overhead water, whether it's rain or from sprinklers, into the soil, and the mulch will absorb some of the water. This is particularly true of fine-textured wood mulches, such as redwood sawdust or shredded redwood, which is often called gorilla hair, and small diameter bark or wood chips. A drip system is a much more efficient way of applying water. Humidity is the degree of saturation of the air with water vapor, and the amount of water that air can hold is related to temperature. The higher the temperature, the more water vapor air can hold. Relative humidity is usually higher along the coast because of the evaporation of water from the ocean. From a plant selection point of view, relative humidity is important because high humidity provides ideal conditions for many diseases to proliferate, such as powdery mildew on roses, borage, some salvias, and tomatoes. We can, of course, apply pesticides for these diseases, but the sustainable approach is to perhaps avoid plants that are susceptible to, for example, powdery mildew. And a good example here would be Monarda Garden View Scarlet, which is pictured in the top right-hand corner. This selection of Monarda is particularly resistant to powdery mildew and is therefore a much better choice in our area. We can also reduce humidity around the plants by providing good air circulation by spacing plants much more widely. Wind is something we need to take into consideration too in our plant selections. Wind is usually stronger closer to the coast, at higher altitudes, and at the top of slopes. Wind affects plants by increasing the rate of evapotranspiration. If water can't be drawn up through the plant from the soil faster than water is being lost from the leaves, then the leaves will be damaged through desiccation. Leaves that are especially vulnerable are ones that are finely dissected or have fine points at the leaf tips. For example, Japanese maples. The large leaves of some plants, such as banana and giant bird of paradise, may also be damaged by the wind. The form or the shape of plants can be altered by the wind. This is often evident at the coast, where plants may be lower growing than they would be in more sheltered areas inland, and this is often referred to as wind pruning. It's also evident in subalpine and alpine ecosystems, and some of you may have seen the windswept contorted forms of bristlecone pine and white pine, for example, in the High Sierra. In areas exposed to wind, we need to select plants whose leaves won't be damaged by the wind. It's good also to select plants that have strong root systems that'll anchor the plant in place when it is windy. And selecting shorter plants and plants with thicker, waxier leaves may also be necessary. Even in locations that aren't exposed to natural winds, artificial wind tunnels may be created because of the orientation of a path along the side of a house or a breezeway between buildings. So be aware of these when you're doing a site evaluation. Depending on the location and the space available, it may be possible to mitigate the effect of wind exposure with a windbreak. The ocean acts as a huge heat sink that helps to moderate temperatures along the coast. So compared to areas further inland, we're usually cooler at the coast during the day in the summer and warmer at night in the winter. The marine layer that's a feature of California's coast in the summer also moderates summer temperatures and increases relative humidity. It also provides a small amount of summer precipitation as the water vapor condenses on the foliage of plants. In fact, in coast redwood forests, fog drip can account for up to 30% of the total annual water input to this ecosystem. Proximity to the ocean also means greater exposure to winds, and in particular, winds that carry salt that can damage the foliage on plants. So for locations close to the coast, we need to select plants that are both wind and salt tolerant. Light isn't usually something we consider in great detail in landscape horticulture. Usually we're just happy to divide plants into shade lovers and sun lovers. But light quality and light quantity both have strong influences on plant growth, and these are covered in much more detail in other classes in the horticulture department. But I think it's important for us in this class to have a basic understanding of the effect of light, so that we can firstly select appropriate plants for sunny and shady locations, but secondly, so that we can use the knowledge as part of our troubleshooting process when a plant appears to be underperforming. Perhaps it's not blooming, perhaps the older leaves are being dropped, or perhaps it doesn't have as dense a growth habit as we thought it would. We'll look at some of these aspects in more detail in the module on plants for shade. For now, let's look at the three basic fundamentals of light as they relate to plants: light duration, light quality, and light quantity. Firstly, let's look at light duration. This is usually referred to as day length or the photoperiod. Day length for us humans refers to the number of hours between sunrise and sunset. And for plants, the biological day length is actually 30 to 40 minutes longer than the duration from sunrise to sunset. But basically, it's the number of continuous hours of light in each 24-hour period. Photoperiod varies with latitude and the time of year. Close to the equator, there's little variation in day length. It's roughly 12 hours of light and 12 hours of dark every day, with little seasonal fluctuation. As we get further away from the equator, there's more variation in day length. Day length changes throughout the year as the Earth's angle to the sun changes, and the variation in day length, often coupled with changes in temperature, can be an important trigger for many plants in their growth cycle. For example, shortening day length coupled with cooler temperatures can act as a trigger for winter deciduous plants to start growing dormant. Conversely, lengthening day length and warmer temperatures in spring can act as a trigger for plants to come out of dormancy. Plants that typically don't bloom until the fall are termed short day plants, and an example of this would be chrysanthemums. Potted chrysanthemums have been a popular plant in the nursery trade for many, many years, and they're typically just referred to as pot mums. And they became a traditional fall plant because they're short day plants and therefore fall bloomers. Also, many of the chrysanthemums bloom in what we typically refer to as fall colors, so bronzy oranges and yellows. Light quality refers to the spectral distribution of light in the blue, green, red, far red, and other portions of the light spectrum. This isn't typically something we think about too much in landscape horticulture unless we're interested in interior landscaping and need to provide supplemental light. Outdoors, the sun typically provides sufficient light in the photosynthetically active regions of the light spectrum for normal photosynthesis to occur. In greenhouse production, light quantity is measured in two ways. Firstly, by the instantaneous amount of light reaching a plant, and this is typically referred to as light intensity, and then the cumulative amount of light that's delivered each day. This is usually referred to as the daily light integral, or the DLI. And in landscape horticulture, the DLI is of more interest to us. Plants have an optimal range of light intensity in which they grow best. And this range is the one with which the plant has evolved in its natural habitat. For example, plants native to the understory of the coast redwood forest have evolved to thrive with very little light. Conversely, shrubs from a chaparral-type plant community have evolved with high lights of light intensity and therefore perform better in full sun. For example, leucadendron, leucospermum, lavender, and rosemary. If we plant plants in a location where the light quantity isn't within their preferred range, then aspects of plant growth are going to be adversely affected, and ultimately the plant may even die. Shade-loving plants that are planted in too much sun may suffer leaf burn or turn yellow. Sun-loving plants planted in too much shade may not flower. For fruit and vegetable crops and many ornamental plants, high levels of light intensity are necessary for development of maximum color or high sugar levels and flavor. As far as plant selection is concerned, we should make sure that there's sufficient sunlight available for our plants to thrive, particularly if we're growing edible fruit crops. The picture on the right here, or the pictures, are of two Fatsia japonicas, the Japanese Aralia. The one in the background shows what a normal Japanese Aralia should look like, with nice glossy medium to dark green foliage. The photo in the inset is of a Japanese Aralia that I've had in full sun, and you can see that it's completely sun bleached. The light intensity has destroyed the chloroplasts in the leaves, and so there's no chlorophyll, the green pigment, and all we're seeing is the yellow pigment showing through in these leaves. So far, we've looked at the major factors influencing climate that, in turn, affect our plant choices. In terms of a specific location, though, there may be aspects of local topography, buildings or other structures, exposure, and existing vegetation that all combine to create microclimates, which are very localized patterns of temperature, precipitation, wind, humidity, and light. Different microclimates can even exist on the same property within very short distances of each other. And we should make sure we identify these microclimates when we're doing a site evaluation. There are many other factors in addition to climate which influence our plant choices. Some of them are listed here on this slide, and we'll go over some of these in more detail when we talk about site evaluation. The main difference, though, between climate and most of the factors listed here is that we have some control over all of these factors, but we have little control over climate or the availability of water. So let's summarize what we've covered in this unit. Climate is a complex interaction of temperature, wind, precipitation, and solar radiation, and is influenced by latitude, altitude, and topography. Most of California has a Mediterranean-type climate pattern, which is believed to have developed between 7 to 4 million years ago. And it's predicted that climate change will accentuate this climate pattern, with probably hotter summers and wetter winters, but also with increased periods of drought. Rainfall and temperature are the two most important climate factors influencing our plant selections, but our choices also need to take the seasonal pattern of rainfall in California into account. Wind speed, relative humidity, solar radiation, and proximity to the ocean also influence our plant choices. And it's important to be aware of the regional climate, but microclimates can also be created by local and site-specific conditions, and we should always take these into consideration when making our plant selections. There are many other factors influencing our plant choices, but to some extent we can control or change those. There's little we can do to change climate conditions, though, and therefore climate's one of the most important factors influencing our plant selections at any given location.